Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the At the Water's Edge podcast, where we look for insights beyond the headlines to take a practitioner's view on national security and geopolitics. It's the 8th of April, 2026. Let's get started. Today, we're going to dive into a question that a lot of folks in Western policy circles and media outlets think they know the answer to. Is the Iranian regime even close to collapsing? Now, if you look at the situation in Iran with a bunch of leaders getting killed, the Ayatollah is dead, now his son's in charge, there's a bunch of economic problems there, there was protests in the streets before this all started, it's easy to think that the regime is more brittle than it actually is. But what if those assumptions are wrong? Our guest today, Arash Azizi, historian and regular contributor to The Atlantic, argues that the Iranian regime is much more resilient than people are giving it credit to, and many of the same conditions that are being cited as evidence of its impending collapse are actually strengthening its staying power. We get into what's really happening inside Iran right now, who actually holds power, why there doesn't appear to be any credible opposition movement to the government, and what a path forward might look like. This is a grounded inside look at Iran. Not headlines, not talking points. With that, let's get to Arash Azizi. Well, Arash, good afternoon and welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today, sir?
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
Pleasure to have you on. For folks who aren't familiar with your work, can you introduce yourself in your own words to the audience?
I am a writer and a historian. I write about politics, history, and cinema. I imagine today we'll talk a lot about my home country, Iran, which is one of the main focuses of what I write about. I live in New York, but I'm originally from Iran.
Wow. When did you leave Iran and come to New York?
I left Iran in 2008. The last time I left was 2008. I didn't come to New York until 2017. But so I lived in other countries. I lived in Europe. I was in Malaysia before, but since 2017 in the US.
Wow. And what brought you to the New York area specifically?
I came to do my PhD here. So I did my PhD at NYU. And
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's why I came here.
Nice. Now, so do you still have family in Iran right now?
Yeah, all my family is in Iran. I mean, my immediate family is in Canada, but everybody else, like my uncles and aunties and my grandmother, she's my only surviving grandparent, and everybody else is in Iran.
Wow. So what are folks in Iran experiencing right now with the ongoing war? What are they going through that maybe isn't being highlighted or reported in Western media?
Well, it's a war, so it's pretty terrible. They're all they're worried about getting killed in the war. Tehran is being bombarded, other parts of the country are being bombarded, but it's not just personal safety. They see that their country is really under threat. There is now repeated threats against sending Iran to a stone age, destroying its infrastructure, changing the map of Iran, and they feel that the main decisions that affect their country are being taken by the Israelis, by the Americans, and by different regime factions, which are also not representative. And the Islamic Republic, of course, is a regime that is opposed by most Iranians. In January, it killed thousands of protesters in cold blood. That was just the latest item in its long rap sheet of crimes. And it also is now really remobilized in the context of the war. So the streets are full of regime supporters who've come out, promising that they'll keep on the regime. So it's a really difficult time for Iranians. They're worried for the future of their country, and they face a resilient regime that really has staked its that is ready to even see the country destroyed so long as it can keep power.
A lot of folks first started paying attention to Iran when, U.S. and Israel started bombing them about a month ago. But if you back up just a few months with Iranian current events, there was this mass wave of protest that seemed to be going on in the country. It seemed to have a lot of traction. This conflict seems to really put a damper on this. What is the current state of domestic opposition to the regime inside of Iran, and has, killing the Ayatollah emboldened them, or has there been a rally around the flag effect with the Iranian public?
Well, neither in a sense, because the opposition to the regime remains widespread. Iranians really have found this regime to bring them very little positive, so they oppose it. But they remain disorganized. They lack organization. They lack political sort of vehicles. They lack clear agendas and workable theories of change that have really been inculcated in a large enough number of people. So because of this, staging a revolution remains very difficult. Now, killing Khamenei made many people happy, but it was quickly followed by the Islamic Republic, quickly, you know, bolstering its ranks. Um, and so in this way, no, it didn't. It didn't really help the people. Now, as for the rally around the regime, so this always the question: what do we mean by rally around the flag? I don't believe that the war has led to a lot more people changing their positions, like from anti-regime to pro-regime. Maybe that has happened for a small number of people, but I don't think it's significant in any real way. Um, but people, of course, have rallied around their country just as they did during the 12-day war. So there's a lot of social solidarity, people trying to help each other during the wartime. And they're also worried. So, and they oppose the US and Israeli attacks on their country because they see it as destructive and as a war that is really destroying their country. But that doesn't mean they support the regime. By and large, that doesn't mean they support the regime. It means that sometimes they're aligned with the regime. I mean, if you have a air defense guy shooting down the missiles that are falling on you and killing you, you guys are at the same side, right? So there's that.
What makes the Iranian regime so resilient? Because it seems that they've been very unpopular for a long time. I think some of the stats I've seen are like between 5 and 15% support, depending on how you want to measure it. But it's been that way for a couple of decades now. We've seen large protest movements. How has the Iranian regime stayed in charge for so long? And even with the Ayatollah being killed, it seems like the current regime is still pretty resilient. How do they pull this off?
They're resilient because they have their minority base, which is probably closer to 15. It's very well mobilized and well organized, and they can keep power by relying on them. But most importantly, the two ways in which the Islamic Republic has remained in power. First of all, brutal suppression of any opponents, basically. And I said they have the core is organized and mobilized and motivated enough to do it. And the other is that it's the lack of any serious opposition to it. The opponents of the Islamic Republic have never been able to really stage a serious opposition to it. For example, all those of us who are abroad have never been able to build organizations to bring together a serious political front that can oppose the regime. And those inside the regime, those inside the country also suffer from, first of all, some of the same divisions, but also the added, of course, repression that they face by the regime. So it's hard for them to come together. So a mix of repression and lack of serious opposition has allowed the regime to stay in power for long, and it might even stay much longer.
I definitely want to get into the opposition because I've had a couple opposition groups on the podcast before sharing some interesting ideas. But for the Iranian government itself, there's this theory in the West with leadership decapitation. If we just take out the guy in charge, everyone else falls in place. Clearly that hasn't happened with the current Iranian regime. But how is the Iranian government actually structured? Who actually runs the government? Is it the Ayatollah? Is it the IRGC? We have figureheads, but who actually has their hands on the mechanisms of power inside the Iranian government?
Constitutionally, most of power belongs to the supreme leader, who is Mojtaba Khamenei now. But as you know, this is the son of the last leader who was killed, and he's not seen in public, so he's hiding behind shadows. It appears to me today that most of the power belongs to Bagher Ghalibaf. He's the Speaker of the Parliament. He's a member of the National Security Council. He's an old ranking member of the Revolutionary Guards, Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, or the IRGC, which is this militia that was founded in 1979 to guard the Iranian Revolution and the Islamic Republic, and that has since come to overpower much of power structures and economic structures in Iran. So it appears to me that Ghalibaf today is the strongest man in Iran and running a war effort, but it's also very much a collective leadership. So National Security Council, different leaders in the Revolutionary Guards, they're running the country, while the civilian government headed by President Pezeshkian takes care of some of the basic, sort of a caretaker. So it takes care of some of the civil structures. But the key political military decisions are taken in the National Security Council, which is a collective body in which Pezeshkian is nominally the head, but he's not the most important figure. The most important figure today is probably Ghalibaf, who is nominally just a member, but he does have a lot of sway in there. There are also other figures in the Revolutionary Guards who have seats in there, like Zul Ghadr, who is the convener and sort of national security advisor, and Vahidi, who's the head of the IRGC. But it appears that Ghalibaf today is stronger.
Gotcha. And, assuming that real diplomacy ever happens between the U.S. and the Iranian regime, which doesn't appear to be actually going on right now, despite what Trump likes to tweet about, who would be the authority inside of Iran that could credibly enter into those negotiations? Who would actually be saying yay or nay to, a peace plan?
The National Security Council, right, which speaks on behalf of the National Security Council, and folks like Ghalibaf. Araghchi, who's the foreign minister, is also in the National Security Council. But if the National Security Council decides, hey, Araghchi, you have plenary power, you can go and negotiate, they can do that. Or if they decide to give that power to someone in Ghalibaf's office or others, they can do that. But it's very much Ghalibaf and the National Security Council as a whole. The
Gotcha.
regime is not so divided as to there are important divisions inside it, but they've also acted in a very disciplined way. So when Mojtaba was appointed, for example, he got immediate support from across the political spectrum, including Pezeshkian, including people like Rouhani, who is the most important contender outside power to the former president Hassan Rouhani, who's much more west-facing, and him and his old collaborator Javad Zarif, former prime minister, have been sounding the peace basically bill, and it's speaking of how they can find a peace plan with the United States. But even them, they accept the structures of the regime as a whole, and they don't revolt against it. So basically, the U.S. does not have a problem of who to speak to in Iran in this sense.
Okay. A stated goal of the current war with Iran is regime change. What would it actually take to facilitate a regime change inside of Iran? Because they've already very unpopular government. They've already had living crap bombed out of them. They're still in power. Doesn't seem to be any outward signs that they're going anywhere. What would it take to actually push this regime out and replace it with something else?
Well, the key is in the something else. What it takes is that to have the something else ready, which people don't. What's the something else? Where is it going to come from? Who's going to form it? Who's going to staff it? What are the current security forces going to do? Are they going to pay allegiance to this new order? Are they going to be subjugated by it? So the key question is that what it will take is, a rival political movement, opposition movement that is ready to do so, and that then it can rely on a variety of ways to come to power. I mean, it can do a stage mass protest and civil disobedience and trade union strikes, the workers' strikes. Yeah, I mean, these are some of the ways it could. Or, of course, by foreign power, there's so much you can do without boots on the ground. With airstrikes, there's so much you can go. It's not so easy to change a regime. Might even be impossible to change a regime by airstrikes alone, unless you hit a country enough, you kill enough of its leaders that it becomes sort of a barren ground, and they have to give up. And then you say, okay, if you give up now, you can do perhaps elections or pass power to this group that we've put together or something of the sorts. Although most Iranians hope that we don't get there.
Gotcha. So
we don't get to the conditions of total destruction, is what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah, no, failed states aren't fun for anybody. I don't think anyone wants to see a repeat of Libya, though it certainly seems like it's a potential here. We've had a spokesperson on before from the National Council of Resistance to Iran, and they've claimed they've got this great 10-point plan that they're ready to go. They could step right in and be a new provincial government. But I was reading an article you wrote about a meeting that happened out in London, I believe last month, with a number of opposition groups. They weren't mentioned anywhere in that article. So I just want to lead into, do you think that they're a credible alternative to the current regime in Iran?
No, of course not. The
Okay.
so-called National Council of Resistance of Iran is linked to Mujahideen Khalq organization. This is a deeply hated organization, not only just unliked, deeply hated by Iranians. And that's because it's a cult. It's a weird Islamist, the Stalinist cult. The last thing Iranians want is to get rid of the Islamic Republic and replace it with a totalitarian cult like that. This is a cult that forces celibacy on its members. In fact, it forced thousands of them to get a divorce. Some decades ago, it forced all of its members to get a divorce so that all their devotion could be to their leader, Masoud Rajavi, who, by the way, not unlike Mojtaba Khamenei, is unseen. They claim he's alive, but he has not been seen in public for more than 20 years. And all women in the group wear exactly the same hijab. As you might see, they have uniform and they cover their hair in exactly the same way. There's tons of reporting and history of how this is a terrible cult. The last thing Iranians want is to replace Islamic Republic with a cult. So, the National Council of Resistance of Iran has, first of all, no credibility because of all of this. It also has very little support amongst Iranians. All polls, all indications show that it has very, very little support amongst Iranians, and for a good reason.
Gotcha. Are there credible Iranian opposition groups? Because, National Council of Resistance of Iran's got its problems. The monarchists have issues. What is a credible opposition to the current regime?
If we had a credible opposition to the regime, the regime would have been overthrown long ago. We don't. The reality is the ranks of the opposition are divided. The monarchists have their issues, but at least they have genuine support in Iran. I mean, they represent part of the Iranian political sphere, although because of their full-on support for the Israeli-American war, their lack of plans, and also the sort of authoritarian wannabe ways of Mr. Pahlavi and his acolytes. I mean, they have their problems, but they represent something. Whereas the MEK and the National Council of Resistance, they represent no one. I mean, they really represent only themselves and their members. They have very little popularity in Iran. As for the rest of us, recently I was in London for the formation of what is called Iran Freedom Congress. Is an attempt to put together all Iranians who oppose the regime and kind of are not in line with Pahlavi either. But it's might be a case of too little, too late, frankly. I hope that it's not, but these are just initial steps toward something that is very difficult. So, unfortunately, though, the lack of a proper Iranian opposition is the main reason the regime has stayed in power for so long, and it's a problem that we're not really close to solving.
Wow. What steps would have to be taken to get closer to that? Because it seems like this has been a problem I think we started seeing mass protests like in the early 2000s, so it's at least 2 decades now, just based off my memory.
That's right. From 1999 we saw, and then 2009, and then 2017, and then look, what needs to be done is for the political activists of the opposition, those who consider themselves political leaders, to first of all come together despite their differences, unite around the common agenda. And we have a common agenda. It's not difficult to find a common agenda. Democratic elections to determine the future of Iran, safeguarding of the territorial integrity, observance of international human rights agenda. You can put together a few conditions. I mean, that's not very easy. That's not very hard. But then you need to put differences aside, come together, build an organization, build a membership organization, recruit people, build a broad front, build international credibility, show that you're ready to take over if the regime is to fall. Secure defection of the security forces, I mean, which is key for a revolutionary victory. But this is not done, and no serious. If the Iran Freedom Congress gets its bearing, it would be a serious step in this way, but it hasn't been done yet.
Gotcha. Do you think that the current war is going to help those efforts or hurt those efforts?
It has hurt them so far, in most ways, because the country is now, the regime is emboldened, mobilized. The opposition, the opponents of the regime, on the other hand, are demoralized. One of the biggest sins of the Iranian opposition is that it pretended like it would be easy for the regime to fall. So a lot of Iranians seem to have been under the impression that, the United States and Israel will attack, and in a few weeks the regime will go, and then something else would happen. But of course, nothing of the sort happened. So I think they're very demoralized, and now they see their entire country under threat. So by and large, and I think, the energies of people are gone. I mean, when the war finishes, who has the energy to go stage a revolution? People just want to stay alive. They want to try to make a living, which is harder and harder by the war. So I think overall it has hurt the chances of the opposition, not helped it.
One of the key sticking points that people tend to get to when they're discussing a transition to a new regime is what happens to the IRGC. The disillusionment of the Iraqi military after America invaded in 2003 was seen as a huge catastrophe. But the IRGC is seen to be staffed by some of the current regime's most ardent supporters, much more so than other parts of the Iranian military establishment. What does the future of the IRGC look like in any sort of transition? Is there a way to keep them intact? They have to be dissolved. You mentioned defections of security forces. Would that come from the IRGC or would it have to come from somebody somewhere else?
It could come from, it has to come from the IRGC, I mean, and other parts, but IRGC is too huge, not, if you want a successful transition in Iran, you're going to need defections from the Revolutionary Guards. The Revolutionary Guards are a very decentralized organization. That means there are, decentralized networks of economic, military concerns. Might be a hotel here, a travel agency there, a telecommunication company somewhere else, and of course, then all these military units. Um, so in terms of what would happen to it, it's what happens to security forces in every democratic transition. They get absorbed, they get renamed, they learn to use their guns differently. I mean, that's every, and some would be decommissioned, some would be recruited, some would be presumably tried for crimes against humanity, mostly would be amnestied, a combination like that. But I mean, so if you had a democratic transition of sorts, this is a very common issue to deal with, like what to do with the armed forces of the previous regime. And you basically merge the IRGC into other armed forces so that the country will have one united military, navy, army, air force, and all that. And yeah, there won't be a separate ideological revolutionary militia that is safeguarded and extra constitutional according to itself.
If there was a change in regime, what type of regime do you think would follow? Would it be a democratic regime? Would it be an alternative authoritarian structure? I know you've written about this previously in foreign policy. A lot of folks think if the Ayatollah falls, democracy immediately follows, but it's a bit more complicated than that. What happens if this regime actually does transition to something else?
It really depends on all of these things can happen. There can be a democratic transition. There can be a transition to a different authoritarian regime. It depends how the fall happens and who is doing the transition, who's doing the transition. The chances of a democratic transition are less now than other chances. That's because, power, people don't like to give up power. Um, a democratic transition is a situation in which, sorry, it's a situation in which the elites make the calculation that um, they will do well um, under a democratic election. So they say, okay, well, if we organize, we'll also have a political party, we'll win some seats, we'll be able to keep our economic privileges and all that. In a situation like Iran, it would be too unpredictable for them to do that. So the current elites will likely hold on to power unless they're dislodged by something more powerful than themselves. That would be a domestic democratic movement or foreign pressure that would force to bring, kind of UN supervised elections or something like that. But I don't see that as very likely. So it remains more likely that whatever follows this Islamic Republic would continue to be authoritarian.
Gotcha. Do you think an opposition group or, the international community should view a transition to another regime that's still authoritarian, but not as theocratic, not following the Ayatollah, more interested in integrating into the international rules based order? Would that be a step in a positive direction that should be pursued as a policy goal? Or is that not enough to justify the effort? Where does that fit in Iran's future?
Well, it would be a positive step, but as for whether it should be a policy goal or not, I mean, I don't know what that would mean exactly, because you cannot determine a government for another country. No, it could mean, so it really is about the details. Like if it would be encouraging the more pragmatic elements in the regime to move in the direction, sure, yeah, why not? I mean, that is because the idea is that even for eventual democratization, that is better because it would mean if you want to be more pragmatic and have relations with the West and have a running economy, that means you have to do a less arbitrary repression. It means that you cannot just arrest people for whatever reason because that's bad for economy too, right? And it means you can't be fighting the world order all the time because you need to be integrated into it. So all of this means that it's good news not just for the West but for Iranians ultimately, even if it's not democratization yet. And in fact, if you want to fight for democratization, you'll do much better fighting for it under these conditions than under the Islamic Republic. or in fact then under sort of failed state conditions.
Hmm. One of the other interesting things about Iran is it's one of the most ethnically diverse countries on the planet. Tons of mountains and valleys. Each valley has its own unique culture going back historically. The Persians managed to unify it, but you still have large ethnic groups that control large swaths of territory, whether it's the Kurds, the Balokis. Do you think a potential future for Iran that should be considered is one where these large ethnic groups break off and form their own autonomous regions as a way to weaken the regime in Tehran and facilitate a transition for the rest of Iran?
First of all, I think you overplay how so-called ethnically diverse Iran is. Actually, 80% of Iranians are either Persian or Turkic speaking. So, all the non-Persian, non-Turkic minorities are 20%. Religious-wise, of course, 99% of Iranians are Muslim. 90% are Shia Muslim. Um, so, and Iran has a lingua franca Persian that is shared very widely, and it's not just shared as a lingua franca, but it's seen as a national language. But millions of Iranians, even if it's not their mother tongue, it's seen as their national language. It's seen as their national heritage language. Whether in reading, literature, music, cinema, there's a shared, uh, you know, there's a shared sphere. Just like Italian is in Italy, despite also many Italians not speaking Italian as their mother tongue, right? So Iran is more like Italy in this way than to say Iraq, where you have like much more um, important divisions. Um, as for these ethnic groups, so playing with ethnic politics in Iran can lead to civil war and many other terrible things. And it's not clear that would weaken the regime. In fact, it might strengthen it because the regime will be able to um, use the boogeyman of separatism and its claim to defend the national integrity to recruit a lot of people. So now playing armed ethnic politics, particularly around the country, is terrible. But of course, all people, all Iranians should should deserve to have full democratic rights. That includes the right to learn their own language, teach their own language, and all the other rights they're deprived from right now.
I was reading through some of the articles you wrote in The Atlantic last night and came across a quote that you pulled from one of the protests popular since 2009. It's neither Gaza nor Lebanon. I give my life for Iran. And I believe you're describing this as a call from younger generations saying that they want to serve Iran, but they don't want to be tied up with Hezbollah, Hamas, all these other foreign entanglements. And that was an interesting parallel for me because there's a lot of folks in the US that kind of feel the same way about our adventurism in the Middle East. We kind of just want to stop playing that game.
Mm-hmm.
What, you're from Iran, you've lived in America. Do you think there's a chance for younger generations to essentially tell their elders to knock it off?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it's a very apt comparison. That yes, that's exactly the sentiment in Iran is anti-interventionist. So just like Americans say, what the hell are we in Iraq for? Why are we in Iran for? Iranians say, why are we in Iraq for? Why are we in Lebanon for? Why are we in Palestine for? These are not our countries, not our rodeo, not our problem. And we shouldn't be wasting our resources there, especially since being there also means international isolation, means regional isolation. So there is that similarity. I don't see it as sort of young versus old generation only. I mean, there are many Iranians who think that, and so I don't see it as the issue of um I don't see it as the issue of young versus old. Um, in Iran, of course, I think the future regimes would have to contend with that and stop this adventurism or to change its form to make it more like what states do. All states try to have regional influence, but not through this extended military interventions, support of armed militias in other countries. So I think, yes, the Iranian political pressure will translate into the next regimes at some point having to give up on this. As for the United States, of course, it's a democracy, so people can elect someone who professes a Middle East policy that they like. And unfortunately, they elected Trump on the premise that he wouldn't be like this. And of course, he turned out to be like this more than any other Democratic president could have dreamed of. So I think I'll just say two things. First of all, is that, yeah, I think anti-interventionism will have a good rap in the next elections. Probably different candidates of both parties try to distance themselves from this war, particularly, depending on how it ends. J.D. Vance from the Republicans seems to have already started effectively to distance himself. It would be interesting to see how he will do versus Marco Rubio, for example, who has a obviously hands-on role in running this war. What else do I want to say? Yeah, sorry, I forgot what else I wanted to say. Yeah, so that's the main point. That I think he will have an outsized role in the next elections.
Gotcha. What do you think an effective foreign policy for the United States to pursue vis-a-vis Iran should be? Assuming the goals are like, hey, yeah, we want the straits open, we want some sort of normalization of relationships, and we want to feel secure that Iran's not going to become a nuclear power. Assuming those three goals were top of mind, what would a reasonable policy for the U.S. to pursue vis-a-vis Iran look like?
Yeah, and I remembered what I wanted to say before, which is linked to
Please.
this, which is that, which is that, it's the Middle East. Several U.S. presidents in a row have just wanted to wash their hands off the Middle East, right? Obama wanted to do it, Biden wanted to do it, even Trump first term wanted to do it, but it's not so easy. It's easier said than done because U.S. has important entanglements there. It has this special relationship with Israel. It has bases in almost every country in the region. So um, so it's not so easy to just leave. It would need to calibrate its policies. It would need to work with its allies more closely. If it wants to leave, it can do what Nixon did effectively, both in Vietnam and in the Middle East, actually, which was to rely on its allies in the region. If you want to leave, you rely on your allies, right? And you let them lead, basically. Now, how would U.S. then reconcile Israel and its Arab allies is the key there. Because of course, Israel continues to be a rugged state effectively in the region, and it has made unhappy most Arab states that are also allies of Israel, allies of the United States, chiefly Saudi Arabia. Now, as to what would the policy be towards Iran, the best policy towards Iran, in my opinion, is to continue supporting the civil society and even the opposition, tell them to get their rank together, get their act together if they want support and all that. But meanwhile, lessen the tensions, try to come to a deal with Iran, which would include diplomatic relations, which would include lifting of the sanctions, find the common ground to meet on important issues like missiles, nukes, regional hormones, and others, so that at the end result will be an Islamic Republic of Iran that has diplomatic relationship with the United States, and that it's in power and its power is sort of recognized, that sanctions are lifted on it. I don't think that's in contradiction of then at the same time supporting the civic opposition and civil society in Iran. I don't think there's any contradiction there. You can do both.
Mm-hmm.
And you can even hope that under such conditions, civic opposition will have a better chance to grow.
Would cutting such a deal with the current Iranian regime, lifting sanctions, ending the war, long term, would that help or hurt the Iranian opposition that wants to overthrow the current regime with something at some point?
Well, it's an interesting question, but because in some ways it would hurt it, because it would undercut it. But let's be honest, the Iranian opposition has no chance of getting what it wants anyways. So it's not like there is no Iranian opposition, actually, is another way of putting it. Because in order for Iranian opposition to be a serious political force, it might have an organization, it must have a political front, it must have networks on the ground. It has none of these things. So there barely exists an opposition. I am a member of this non-existing opposition myself, and I think ultimately it will be better for us, because if there are economic ties with the United States, if there are diplomatic ties, if Iran normalizes, integrates into the region better, it would mean that the civil society will have better chances. It would people will be doing better. The middle class will exist again. It was effectively destroyed under the sanctions. And then they can engage in civic actions like asking for freer elections and asking for more freedoms and all that. And that is a better basis of a pro-democracy opposition activity than this apocalyptic reason that things have to get so bad that there will be some grand break and the regime will fall and then the new thing will come up. Much of the opposition views it this way, but I think is mistaken. I think we should instead support people's lives getting better, and try to then use that politically to better our chances. Yeah, this is why I also supported the Iran nuclear deal in 2015, and I generally support de-escalation and diplomatic furtherance between Iran and the United States.
Yeah. The Iranian nuclear deal was one of the most significant diplomatic events in modern world history. Remarkable achievement that it was even able to get pen to paper on that. The current Trump regime and a lot of hardliners in the U.S. and Netanyahu, of course, constantly harp on Iran's nuclear program as an existential threat to America and the world. What threat do you think Iran's nuclear program actually poses? Is it some sort of way to get to a nuclear weapon? Is it a matter of national pride? Does it serve a legitimate scientific and energy production interest inside the country? How does Iran view its nuclear program?
Iran has a very serious nuclear program, and that many in Iran do think should be weaponized, and so it is a legitimate threat. Is a threat to the world and to the region, especially considering this is also a very rogue regime and a regime that doesn't play by international norms at all. So yeah, it's a real threat. The question is how to neuter it, and 2015 deal was a great way of doing so. It really effectively stopped Iran's weaponization, but it's a real threat.
Okay. What do you think that people here in America misunderstand the most about Iran?
I don't think people in the United States think that much about the world for them to understand or misunderstand something, frankly. So, I think the average American doesn't concern himself a lot with the world affairs. Yeah, and sometimes, so I don't, and it also depends if the people who do, have no reason to believe that they're misinformed, right? So I think, like, what are some of the common misconceptions, I guess, about Iran? One misconception might be that they don't see there are many differences inside the Islamic Republic, as a regime, and that it's not like uniform, and that there are many who would deal with the West, while many are anti-Western hardliners. And that the people of Iran also just want a better life, so they don't wake up to be anti-Western or pro-Western, or they just they want a better life, so they'll shift what policies they support, based on that. So these are some things that come to mind.
Okay. Well, as this war continues, and we'll see if President Trump starts bombing all the electrical infrastructure in Iran and the bridges this week. But what do you think the best case scenario for Iran is over the next 12 months, and what do you think the worst case scenario for Iran is over the next 12 months?
The best case scenario would be a democratic transition. If somehow under international pressure the regime accepts to organize democratic elections, or somehow democratic elections arrive. Of course, it's a bit of a Pollyanna. This is optimistic, but it's the best case scenario. But there's very little chances of it coming to happening, unfortunately. The worst case scenario is civil war and disintegration of the state and a failed state, and that more war and misery and prolonged war of attrition and warlordism and ethnic civil war all over Iran. And, unfortunately, things can always get a lot worse.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today. Right before we wrap, though, is there anything that I should have asked you about that I didn't ask you about?
No, I think your questions were very good and comprehensive, and have a good view of where we are. Yes, unfortunately, this war can lead to a lot of terrible outcomes, but we can still remain hopeful that something better can follow.
Well, I'll be hoping along with you. No one wants a failed state, and no one likes pain misery going on longer than it needs to. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks for having me. Thank you.